Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, December 13th, 2023, and 'tis the season to nullify. We're kicking off nullification season for 2024, and that means we'll be monitoring, reporting on, and more importantly, taking action in support of all kinds of legislation in the states over the next few months, really, that follow the founder strategy of how to use state and individual action, noncompliance, and other forms of resistance to defeat federal programs without waiting on the federal government to do something it never does, magically limit its own power. And it's really kind of the third of what turned out to be a mini-series. And last week, Friday, I did an episode highlighting the ways that the founding generation and shortly after used this same strategy in the early days of the Republic and refuted, for example, how people claim things played out against the whiskey tax. And then on Monday, I followed that up by pointing out that this is the same strategy that the old revolutionaries used successfully in the American Revolution against the British. So today, let's first kick it off before getting into what's going on in the states for 2024. This is just a brief introduction of what we're following so far. There will be much, much more on many other issues as well. But today we're talking about things like taking action against the Federal Reserve, a central bank digital currency, supporting sound money, even federal gun control and some prohibition, the FDA, the CBDC of all places. I'll get to that in just a moment. But quick, let's start out with a little bit on this strategy, and I want to highlight someone that I can't stand, but, well, when he says the right thing, it's the right thing. Alexander Hamilton, here in Federalist number 28. He said it may be safe. This was his argument. Now, Hamilton was a flip-flopper, and we know that he said what he wanted to say in order to get what he wanted done. And what he wanted done, even though he didn't like what they came out with the Constitution, he wanted a much more powerful central government with power over the states in all cases whatsoever. This is the same thing Madison wanted as well at the early days, but I think he was convinced otherwise to just go with what they went. But Hamilton, of course, duplicitous, pushed for what he wanted after ratification anyways. But selling it to the people, they ratified on these views, especially in New York primarily. The Federalist Papers weren't influential outside of there, but he helped convince them to ratify on these views. And here in Federalist number 28, one of the arguments from the Anti-Federalists was, of course, they were concerned that it was going to be too centralized, too consolidated. So the Federalist argument over and over and over, whether it's Hamilton or Madison or James Wilson or Theophilus Parsons and so many others, Roger Sherman, who I'll get to in a moment, pointed out that, look, okay, yeah, things might go bad, but the power of the people in the states are strong enough to stop the feds when the feds get out of line. And even Hamilton had that to say as well. In Federalist 28, he said, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that the state governments will, in all possible contingencies, afford complete security against invasions of the public liberty by the national authority. This isn't just about appointing people to the Senate by the state legislature, because that isn't complete security. That's just being able to choose the people to maybe act as a check and balance in Washington, D.C. But merely choosing a couple of people for the Senate or a person for the Senate does not mean that they can get rid of stuff or block things all the time. So complete security means far more action. And in Federalist 33, Hamilton pointed out that acts that are not in pursuance of the Constitution are not supreme and deserve to be treated as such. So in other words, they're void, and we have to act like that too. Anyways, he goes on, he says, they can at once adopt a regular plan of opposition in which they can combine all the resources of the community. They can readily communicate with each other in the different states and unite their common forces for the protection of their common liberty. But of course, if those tools exist and they don't use them, there is no check. The federal government, of course, has checks and balances with itself. But there's also, as Madison, Hamilton, and so many others pointed out, that states also act as a check on the federal government, federal power. But if the states don't do what they're supposed to do and the people don't do what they're supposed to do, then federal power is unchecked and eventually unlimited. We have the largest government in history. So he points that out as well. Also in Federalist 28, the obstacles to usurpation and the facilities of resistance increase with the increased extent of the state, provided the citizens understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. It's very similar to what Samuel Adams had said many years earlier during the American Revolution. He said all might be free if they value freedom and defended it as they ought. So if the people are willing to stand up for their liberty, they will have it. It may take some time, and it may be difficult. It may be a struggle. As Jefferson pointed out, he said, we're not going to get from despotism to liberty in a feather bed, but the people can win. Roger Sherman put it this way in December of 1787, talking about what needs to be done. So Hamilton says they have the power to do this if the people choose to do this. It's the same thing that Samuel Adams had said. And then here's Roger Sherman. Though the general government in matters within its jurisdiction is paramount to the constitutions and laws of the particular states, yet all acts of Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of a majority of the states. And it's important to point out that if you're talking about a conflict that results in trying to enforce something and relying on the states to help enforce, and the states don't do that, that implies, it should be pretty obvious, that in order to defeat a federal program, the people have to refuse to comply with it. And that's what Sherman's getting at here. Otherwise, there's no need. If everyone complies, there's no concern about trying to enforce something. He's pointing out that the people and the states will resist or must resist. And that's exactly what James Madison said should be done, writing in Federalist number 46 a few weeks later. He said to use state legislative devices. He's only talking about action by individuals and states. He said the disquietude of the people, their repugnance, and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Again, we've got a zillion examples of supporters of the Constitution saying the same, that it's up to the people and the states to keep things in check. John Dickinson said the same thing as well. But again, those tools don't work if people don't use them. So with that, let's look at some of the ways that maybe they're trying to use them for 2024. First of all, let's talk about a central bank digital currency. Here in South Carolina, Senate Bill 861 was just filed in the South Carolina Senate and would expressly exclude a central bank digital currency, CBDC, from the definition of money in South Carolina, creating potentially significant roadblocks to its use as such in the states. Similar legislation has already been signed as law in both Indiana. Indiana was first, and then Florida just this year in 2023. Now, in short, the more that states do stuff like this, the more obstacles and lawsuits and just stuff that the feds are going to have to deal with, more pushback. The more that we put roadblocks in their way, the less likely it is that they'll be able to pull this off. And I've got an example at the end of how the financial system, they're trying to use credit cards to basically do surveillance on people who purchase firearms, but by putting roadblocks in the way like this, very similar to this, we've at least been able to put that program on hold. So the more that the feds have to go through to implement, they still might pull it off, but it's less likely they'll do it. That's exactly what James Madison told us in Federalist number 46. So Senate Bill 861 in South Carolina takes a step against a central bank digital currency because we know if no one does anything to oppose it, they are guaranteed going to shove that thing down our throats, no matter what anybody tells you. The only way you can stop it is by doing stuff to try to stop it. A very similar piece of legislation was filed in Missouri just at the beginning of this month, Senate Bill 826. So it also removes, if it passes, it would remove a central bank digital currency from the definition of money, and therefore Missouri would be saying, well, you can't use it as money within the state. Well, there's no contractual requirements, whatever. We're not going to enforce it in court, etc. But from Mike Meharry's report on this, the legislation would go a step further than other states with an additional provision to prohibit a state or local government agency from accepting CBDC as payment. It would also prohibit any public entity from participating in a test of a CBDC by the Federal Reserve, because, of course, they're going to go through a testing process, and the less organizations and the less states and the less governments that participate and the less people that decide to use it, ultimately, this all gets down to the people. If the people go along with this in large numbers, then nothing's going to stop it. Again, it gets down to, first of all, the people have to refuse to participate and refuse to comply, and then the actions of the states have some or more impact. So Senate Bill 826 was filed in Missouri. And then also I just saw this one last night, a little bit late on it because it was just filed on December 6th. It has 17 co-sponsors in Wisconsin. House Bill 725. It's pretty much the same concept as what they're doing in Missouri, both saying it's not going to be considered money in the state, a central bank digital currency, and the state won't participate. Again, this has just been filed. There's a lot of steps to be able to get it passed, but I wanted to make sure you guys were aware of that. Now, before getting to a little bit more on sound money and taking action to undermine the Federal Reserve and support actual money instead of the fiat trash that they keep destroying the value of, I want to point out something that's really important, something that we've worked on for many years, and that is efforts to stop states from participating in the enforcement of federal gun control. The number of federal gun control measures that should exist under the Constitution is zero. That includes the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, and everything since. Of course, the Undetectable Firearms Act, etc., etc. And the ATF has only about 3,700 employees throughout the country. The record amount of enforcement actions that they've been able to complete is somewhere between 10 and 11,000 per year. That's 10 to 11,000 too many. But if you think of it this way, if there's 13 million undocumented short-barreled rifles, all in so-called violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934, which shouldn't exist, the ATF shouldn't exist, well, there's no way they're going to be able to do anything about it. So the more that states opt out of doing enforcement actions for the ATF, because almost every ATF enforcement action is in conjunction with state and local law enforcement, oftentimes with the DEA as well, the less that they participate, the more that it is likely that the people and the states can win. So in Ohio, there are a number of states that have taken action along these lines, pushing the ball forward. The big one, of course, that most people know about is Missouri. It's a very complex law, so it landed in court. We don't want it to go in court, so that's the most effective one. I think in practice, there's also Montana, Kentucky, Arizona, and in some small steps, Idaho, but you have to keep pushing forward. You can't just rest once you get step one done. You got to keep pushing forward. So hopefully we'll see more from those states. But in Ohio, House Bill 51, also the Second Amendment Preservation Act, modeled after Missouri, but with some updates and changes in the legal language to make it less likely to have to go through a court case, would ban state and local law enforcement officers from enforcing, attempting to enforce, or participating in the enforcement of any federal acts, executive orders, administrative orders, rules, regulations, statutes, or ordinances regarding firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition that are not mirrored in state law. A good step forward. It had a lot of pushback from some establishment types. It finally got passed out of committee by a vote of 7-5 in November. We were told a number of times that this was coming to the floor, since I think the Speaker of the House is in support, but there's some other people who have some power, and the establishment red team people have some power. It's supposed to come for a vote. It was supposed to go to a vote last week, Wednesday, and then they did a parliamentary move at the last second, said, nope, we're not going to do it. And then, so it was supposed to come to a vote again today. I think this might be the last day of the session for the year where they're able to do floor action without some type of emergency parliamentary move. And yesterday, they pulled kind of a parliamentary move where they kicked it back to committee, making it very unlikely that it'll get passed. But I want to point out that it is generally the establishment red team, along with their financial backers in law enforcement lobby groups, that fight most aggressively against this type of legislation. So it's very important to know that. You definitely, if you live in Ohio, you definitely want to let your state representatives know that you support House Bill 51. In case it doesn't get through today and doesn't get through maybe in one more try in the next month, then we want to get another round at this, another crack at it again. Anyway, so that's the Second Amendment Preservation Act in Ohio, and we expect to see a number of other states consider similar legislation in 2024. Just none have been filed as of yet. So let's get back to sound money. Over in Missouri again. So you'll see kind of a pattern. Some of the states start filing their legislation early, and the rest of them in the first week or so of January as well. Senate Bill 735 would take steps to treat gold and silver as money in Missouri, as it always should have been, and encourage its use as such, making it legal tender and eliminating state capital gains tax on the sale of gold and silver. The proposed law, this is a report by Mike Meharry, also includes provisions authorizing the state to invest in gold or silver greater than or equal to 1% of all state funds. So building a sound money, a precious metal reserve within the state of Missouri, which is going to be really important. I believe they passed something like this in Tennessee this past year. So being able to at least establish that, I think, if the states ever get a little bit smarter than they are today, creates an environment where they can act as a hedge against what could be runaway inflation at some point in the future. This type of thing can happen, and I don't have any expertise on whether it will for sure or when, but having that hedge is very, very important. So that's a nice, interesting piece that included in this legislation, and would also expressly bar any state agency, department, or political subdivision from seizing gold or silver bullion. So that's Senate Bill 735, sound money supporting as are required by Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. All the states have been ignoring this for so many years until 2011 when Utah passed the Specie Legal Tender Act in 2011, followed by Oklahoma, then Wyoming, and then just this last year, a very similar bill was signed into law in Arkansas. So Missouri could be state number 5, and I think if Missouri does it, it'll really ramp up pressure on a number of other states to do this. We see very similar legislation already filed in Florida. This is the first time I've really seen a good sound money bill filed in Florida in many, many years, and it normally doesn't go anywhere, but hopefully there will be some push to get this done. It's Senate Bill 750 and House Bill 697, and would also establish a bullion depository, so kind of like an outside the Federal Reserve System, sound money banking system within the state. So that's the Florida Legal Tender Act, Senate Bill 750, and House Bill 697. Now, this one I was actually kind of surprised to see up in New Hampshire, but then again, maybe I shouldn't be surprised. This is a really, really unique bill. Nothing like this I've seen before. And it's House Bill 1156. It would end all state and local cooperation with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and the World Health Organization, WHO. And if you think about how things have played out in recent years, I think there's plenty of people who are really interested in a bill like this. It would prohibit the state and its political subdivisions, so basically all local governments, anything that's basically government involved in the state, they cannot do these things, from engaging in the enforcement of or collaborating with the enforcement of any requirements, mandates, recommendations, instructions, or guidance provided by either organization. So if they're going to make a health decision, it's not going to be based on what the CDC or the WHO says. And of course, we know how so many social media platforms, including probably wherever you're watching or listening to this on, they took positions to back up what one of those organizations had to say, even if they were in conflict, and they would use that as a tool to go against people. But if the state of New Hampshire says, well, we're not going to do that in our own state, it creates, again, another roadblock. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll address social media, but maybe some other important areas as well. The legislation specifically states that, quote, any requirements, mandates, recommendations, instructions, or guidance by either organization shall not be used in this state to justify any max, vax, or medical testing requirements, and shall have no force or effect in New Hampshire. I don't know if this thing is going to pass at all, but Representative Michael Granger with 7 co-sponsors filed that, and it's going to be, once the legislative session officially starts in January, it will get a committee hearing. The interesting part about New Hampshire is in most states, either the floor leader or the Speaker of the House or the committee members, the committee chairs, have such immense power. And what they do is they hold legislation hostage. So if you file a really good bill, it's going to be dead no matter what. If the Speaker decides to send it to a committee that is hostile to that legislation, and they know the chair is hostile to it, they call it a kill committee. This happens a lot in Missouri. It also happens in Arizona, where they don't even have to. They wait till the end of the session to send it to a committee. They're required to send everything to a committee for consideration so there can be public debate, but they send it so late that they can't even schedule a hearing. So these are scammy tactics. In New Hampshire, though, it's interesting. Everything gets a committee hearing. Everything gets a committee vote. And even if the committee votes no on it, it's not really yes or no. They have recommendations of ought to pass or do pass, ought to pass with amendments, or ought not to pass, ONTP, in New Hampshire. So the committee will make a recommendation. If it's ought to pass, and generally in the House, because it's a really large body, they take a voice vote and it almost automatically sails through. Ought not to pass means it automatically almost always gets killed, but sometimes it still passes. Everything gets a floor vote in New Hampshire. So we will see debate and vote on basically taking the first step to nullify the CBDC in a state in New Hampshire. So to me, that's very, very interesting, and I think it'll get a lot of attention. Now, we're going to be linking to all this legislation over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley will be doing all the organization for that blog post in the next couple of hours. And he'll include links to all the legislation and the reports that I'm mentioning here, plus a few other things, some of those original source documents from the beginning of the episode. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That'll be published in the next few hours after the live stream is done. I want to take a quick moment while I'm here, pausing, I guess, on the reporting to say a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you being here, whether you're live or in the archive, it's your first episode, or you've been here for every single one since day one. I can't thank you enough. But hello goes out to Douglas Fox and Dixie Strong, Cheriton Farmer, Jacob, Clay Kent, Tyler, Ragnar, King Nobody, Haji, Sonny, and I know I'm scrolling through here, Lawrence Smith, and a few others. I know I'm missing a few people, but I really appreciate you being here. Please do continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archive, smashing the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. These are the types of things that if you're not able to pitch in financially, and I'll mention this at the end, our membership program to help us do this kind of work, you can also help us spread the word. Even if you don't have a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat to throw our way, please consider taking those actions because it can trigger the algorithms and tell it to show us to more people. And it does help out a great deal. So again, I appreciate that. Let's get back to the bill reports. I want to go to South Carolina again. And we're talking about the Defend the Guard Act, which, man, we've been working on this for so many years. We just never had the grassroots support to really get it pushed because it really takes a lot of focused single issue coalition building and people who are willing to lead an effort on a particular issue. So once bringourtroopshome.us kind of took the baton on this from people like Pat McGeehan in West Virginia and started running with it, we've seen it getting introduced much more. It passed a legislative chamber in Arizona for the first time in history. So we're getting the ball closer. As Thomas Jefferson told us, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches because it takes time to convince people even what is for their own good. That's my paraphrase of his great letter to the Reverend Charles Clay in 1790. So the Defend the Guard Act would prohibit the governor from releasing any unit or member of the South Carolina National Guard or any state that it's been introduced in into active duty combat unless Congress has passed an official declaration of war as required by the Constitution, something they have not done since the 1940s. And I know a lot of people think that an authorization to use military force qualifies because they say it in the text. They say, well, this is to, under Article 1, Section A of the Constitution, this fulfills our requirement for declaration of war, even though they're really not doing that. Because what's the problem? I mean, the AUMF could be a proper declaration of war if Congress is saying we are going to use force against this country. And then the the executive branch doesn't have a choice. It's his job as commander-in-chief. He doesn't get to choose whether or not that's going to happen because Congress has declared war. And it's the people, the representatives of the people and of the states who are to make that decision, not some dude in the White House. There is nothing from the founding generation. No matter what all the experts tell you, there is zero indication from anything in the founding generation that a single guy gets to make that call. And the AUMFs that have been used in modern times, all of them, what they do is say it is up to the president, the executive branch, to make the determination if and when force will be used. We're just saying you can. So they're passing the buck. They're delegating a power that the founding generation and the people of the several states, the ratifiers, said had to go to this branch of government and just passing along to somebody else. It's as bad as Congress, as the judiciary saying, well, we're not going to hear this case. We authorize Congress to do it. But this is absolutely absurd. But somehow, some reason, and for whatever, maybe because people live in fear and they believe the government is going to protect them, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard at this point, they believe that it's okay to let this happen. So they've turned a blind eye to it over and over and over. But the Defend the Guard Act is a first step towards rectifying that because They say we're not going to release these troops unless you pass a declaration of war. Otherwise, everyone, as John Jay told us, until war is constitutionally declared, all the members of the country must observe and preserve peace. So without that declaration of war, they can't do it. Or if they've taken, the other requirement is taken an official action pursuant to Clause 15, Section 8, Article 1 of the United States Constitution. I don't like how they worded that, but to explicitly call forth the South Carolina National Guard and any member thereof for the enumerated purposes, to expressly execute the laws of the Union, repel an invasion, or suppress an insurrection. So you can read the Constitution itself, but that is basically getting some text from the Constitution saying the reasons why they can call them forth. So Defend the Guard Act would reject that. Now, this legislation has already also been filed in Missouri as House Bill 1521. In New Hampshire, in House Bill 229, this has gone through the committee process already in New Hampshire, and it will get a floor vote. I don't know when, but maybe sometime in January. It's going to be tough to get it passed, but there has been a lot of grassroots pressure going there. Diego Rivera and a number of other people have really been leading the charge. We're so grateful for the work that they're doing. So House Bill 229 will be getting a House vote in New Hampshire soon. Michigan Senate Bill 642 was just filed. In Tennessee, we just got the update yesterday that House Bill 1609 was filed. And as I mentioned, you want to follow bringourtroopshome.us if you want more details and action items on this, because we expect at least a dozen more states to consider similar legislation. And if you want to learn more about it, I've got an episode up here on the screen from last year, Defend the Guard, Support the Constitution, Resist the Empire. That will be linked to in the show notes that, of course, Alan organizes, and I will get published in a couple of hours. Back to Missouri, let's talk about raw milk. Or just milk, unpasteurized milk, whatever you want to call it. The legislation, this is House Bill 1711. The legislation would legalize the sale of grade A retail raw milk or cream produced in Missouri at grocery stores, restaurants, soda fountains, or similar establishments. But currently, Missouri law only allows the sale and delivery of raw milk directly from the farm to a consumer. I think it's fascinating that here in California, where, of course, we live in a total nanny state, they want to control anything and everything. But I can go down to a corner market and pick up a container. Now, generally not at the kind of the multi-state chain stores, but local chains and smaller markets. I can go there and I can pick up raw milk, raw kefir, raw cream, raw whatever, because they don't prohibit it. It's a food. Why does it matter? Why does the government have to be involved in choosing what's going to be healthy or not? In fact, the more the government chooses to get involved in that, maybe tell us that there's just these weird food groups, the less healthy people will be. I don't know why. Again, people trust government to make the right choice for their health. I can't imagine going to the organization that has run up trillions and trillions in debt and been responsible for basically killing millions of people around the world, all in violation of the Constitution and moral justice and things like that, whatever you want to call it. These people aren't to be trusted. So why do we rely on them to tell us? We can make our own decision on what's best for ourselves, our family, our children, our grandparents, etc. So I can go pick up raw milk whenever I want. And sometimes I do, not real often. I have a dairy allergy. Why do you need to know this? But I have a dairy allergy. But I learned a few years ago that it is the pasteurization process that affects me. So if I drink a regular cup of milk, I am pretty sick within 72 hours. If I drink it raw, somehow what I've been told is that there's bacteria in there that my system needs that gets killed by the process. And so now I can actually have cheese and milk again. And it's really amazing because I'm originally from Wisconsin and I grew up on that, but was always ill. So anyways, it's currently prohibited at retail establishments. You can go directly to a farm, and I know some people love doing that, but not everyone has access, and that does limit the availability. Now, what makes this interesting is because it could have an impact on a federal prohibition scheme. Because as Mike Meharry points out in his report, not only do the feds ban the transportation of raw milk across state lines, they also claim the authority to ban unpasteurized milk within the borders of a state. So that interstate commerce clause thing, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, when it's about making commerce regular among the several states, as some people would like to put it, but let's say regulating commerce among the several states, across state lines. They claim the power that something that's wholly intrastate, if it's produced within the state, bought, sold, and consumed within the state, this is not interstate commerce, but the feds still claim the power to ban it. Now, they haven't done that on an intrastate level, maybe because that would probably look bad to a lot of people, at least who have been buying this in various places, Pennsylvania, California, and elsewhere. And now all of a sudden they're saying you can't. Well, here's how FDA officials put it this way. It is within HHS's authority to institute an intrastate ban on unpasteurized milk as well. But that's never going to happen if all 50 states legalize it. And in fact, what will end up happening is what we're seeing happen on cannabis as well. Eventually, the more states that do this, their interstate ban becomes almost totally ineffective as well. And you start seeing stuff getting shipped all over the place, even though the feds don't want you to do it. A similar piece of legislation was just filed in Wisconsin, Senate Bill 781. It's amazing to me. The dairy lobby is very, very strong. They're partnered with government. This is mercantilism in effect in Wisconsin. They've been able to block this type of legislation for many years. So I haven't seen 17 co-sponsors on a Senate bill to legalize retail sales of raw milk in Wisconsin before. So maybe that will have a nice push. Now back to New Hampshire. For the one that I mentioned at the beginning, I'm like, well, we've got an example of how putting up roadblocks can actually stop a program from being implemented. And here, House Bill 1186, titled the Firearm Purchasers Privacy Act. We've seen it called the Second Amendment Financial Privacy Act in other states. I don't think that's a good name because your right to keep and bear arms is not your Second Amendment right. You just have a natural right of self-defense, and you don't get it from an amendment. So the Firearm Purchasers Privacy Act is a great name for this from Jason Janvrin, and 6 other co-sponsors. It would prohibit a financial institution or its agent from requiring or assigning a specific firearm or ammunition merchant code separately from general merchandise retailers or sporting goods retailers to any firearms business located in New Hampshire. The short version: back in September of 2022, last year, the International Standards Organization, which is based in Switzerland, this is for credit card processing. They approved what's known as a merchant category code. If you've run a small business and you have credit card processing, you get a category code for the type of business. So when it goes to the banking system operates totally under the purview and approval of the government. And the Patriot Act is very, very influential on how banks respond to stuff. So if the feds say, we don't want you to approve these types of transactions, you basically have a kill switch. Anybody who has a merchant category code that's firearm retailers, well, it'd be very easy for MasterCard and Visa and American Express. And the MasterCard people are really on top of this, I think. Well, they want to take this information and use it to track, provide surveillance on who's making these types of purchases. Of course, you can use cash or crypto or gold or something like that. But there's a lot of people who make purchases online. The more that you limit the market through government intervention, the worse things are. So we want to get government the hell out of the way. And part of the way they do that sometimes is leaning on these international kind of accreditation organizations. And I'm not sure exactly who started this. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I did an episode on this earlier in the year that probably has that in there. But they've been pushing to try to get more tracking on firearms purchases so they can do surveillance and effectively kick people out of making those types of purchases. So that was in September 22. They were going to put together this category code and say, well, now we're tracking it. But in response to legislation like House Bill 1186 in New Hampshire, the major credit card payment networks have paused implementation of the Firearms Merchant Code. They were going to implement it. They made a big splash about doing it. And then a number of states started introducing this type of legislation in 2023. And even before a single one was passed into law, they're like, well, wow, we better hold back. Now, I think the CBDC people were not going to do that because they have the force of government right behind them. But this is another way. This is a partner of the government that kind of crumbled pretty quickly. They paused it. In an email to Reuters, a MasterCard representative said such bills would cause inconsistency in how the code could be applied by merchants, banks, and payment networks. So then it was signed into law in Idaho, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, and Montana. So we've got 5 states. First, a bunch of states considered it. Then they said, we're going to hold off on this. And then we started putting out the message, and I think some other people got the idea like, oh, if they're pausing just to see because legislation was introduced, what if we get 10, 15, 20 states make it law that this type of thing is illegal in the state and they won't be allowed to use them? Well, that's going to make it even more likely that they never get to implement it. Again, the more that we see this type of roadblock put up, the less likely they'll be able to do the additional gun control surveillance. So already signed as law in Montana, Texas, North Dakota, Florida, and Idaho. This is New Hampshire, House Bill 1186. There's also Oklahoma, Senate Bill 814, and even New Jersey. I don't think that one's going to pass, but I should mention it to our great friends in New Jersey, the few of you, like the few of us here in California who actually love liberty. I know you're out there. You got something to chew on. Assembly Bill 5709. And we've got a lot more on the way on these issues and others. Civil asset forfeiture, surveillance, more gun control stuff, protecting the right to keep and bear arms from gun control, of course. And if you want to get up to speed on how things have played out so far, you got to get a copy of our State of the Nullification Movement report, which is 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It's almost totally updated for 2023. I sent a handful of these out to I picked at random. Some of our members, I sent a few dozen of these out as a thank you. We will also make it available in various forms. It's being worked on now for a Kindle version, an EPUB, so it can go on all the kind of the e-reader platforms. But we do have available today a pretty decent version of the PDF available that you can download and read for free. It's almost like 150 some odd pages. We cut out a lot of the images and kind of graphic design stuff and just made it just straight text this year to make it easier on printing and the file size. So 10thamendmentcenter.com/report is where you can get up to speed on that. And absolutely nothing helps us stay up to date on these kinds of bills, report on them, set up action alerts, and get people moving to take action in support more than the financial faith and support of our members. I mentioned earlier, if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, lifetime, and 5-year options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be extremely grateful to any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. Or if you want to just do a one-time donation, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I'm going to take a look over in the chat. I see some interesting back and forth with Kirk and John and Haji and a few others. I appreciate all your feedback. Good to see Henlo and Cowboy Roy Rogers and Dave over on Facebook. If you don't believe in the natural right of self-defense, corner a groundhog sometime. That might be the comment of the week. Thank you so much for that, Dave. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone who spent some time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. If you are in support of any of the legislation that I've mentioned, call your state representative and state senator and ask them to co-sponsor and support similar legislation in your state or to get on board with the legislation that's already been filed. It's going to take action from the people themselves to get these things passed. They don't pass anything unless they think it's popular. So they want to hear from you, and sometimes just a few dozen phone calls on a state level can make a huge difference. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you want to get us some support. I really appreciate that. 10thamendmentcenter.com/report to learn more. I appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.